I need to check the names file carefully before writing. The band names are Robert, Daniel, Courtney, Phil, Victor, Helen, Marcus, Carla, Theodore, Nathan, Gwen, James, Leonard, Simone, Wesley, Patricia, Arnold, Damon, Kristen, Beverly, Garrett, Sasha, Pauline, Frank, Miles, Eddie, Oliver, Raymond, Conrad, Amber, Lily, Irene, Bryce, Tiffany, Walter, Renee, Preston, Cody, Gordon, Elliot, Nadia, Stuart, Harold Baxter, Claire, Derek, Eugenia, Eugene Calloway, Bo, Solomon, Harlan, August Calloway, Theo, Vivienne, Petra. I'll use Alton, narrator/father, Kendrick, son, Brianna, daughter-in-law, Marlene, narrator's late wife, Douglas, lawyer. My name is Alton Price, and I am 58 years old. I built a plumbing supply business from nothing. Started with a second-hand truck, a phone number on a magnetic sign stuck to the door, and about $4,000 I had saved working double shifts at a warehouse outside of Columbus for 3 years straight. That was 1991. By the time my son Kendrick graduated high school, I had 12 employees, 2 warehouses, and a contract with 3 commercial builders in the county. I tell you that not to brag. I tell you that because you need to understand what it cost me. Not in money, in time, in years I will never get back. My wife Marlene passed in 2019, pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. She was 53 years old and she never once complained. Not once, even in the last weeks when I could see it in her face how much pain she was in after she was gone. I rattled around that house alone for a long time. 6 bedrooms. The house we had built together when Kendrick was 9. He used to ride his bike up and down the driveway. Marlene used to plant tomatoes along the back fence every spring. I kept planting them after she died. I don't even really like tomatoes that much. I just couldn't stop doing it. Kendrick met Brianna about 2 years after his mother passed. I want to be fair to her. When I first met Brianna, she seemed fine. Polite. She worked in medical billing, had a decent apartment on the east side, drove a reliable car. I thought, okay, my son is happy. That's enough. I had him over for dinner most Sundays. Sometimes she came, sometimes she didn't. That was fine too. They got engaged in the spring of 2022. I gave Kendrick my mother's ring to use, and I also quietly paid off the rest of what he owed on his car, about $7,000, as an engagement gift. He knew about the car. He didn't know I had also started a joint savings account that I planned to give them as a wedding gift, $40,000. Money I had set aside over several years specifically for that purpose because Marlene always said, when Kendrick gets married, we're going to give them a real start. I was keeping that promise for her. I paid for most of the wedding, catering, venue, photographer. The whole thing came out to a little under $32,000. I didn't complain. I didn't make a speech about it at the rehearsal dinner. I just wrote the checks because that's what you do when your son gets married and you have the means to help. After the wedding, they moved into a rental townhouse about 12 minutes from my house. I helped them move. I bought them a new refrigerator because the unit in the townhouse was old, and I noticed Brianna make a face at it when we first walked through. I paid first and last month's rent so they could start with something in their savings. I mention all this not to keep score. I mention it because in about 18 months, both of them would stand in my kitchen and tell me I had never done enough. The shift happened gradually. I noticed Brianna started referring to my house differently, not your dad's house, not Alton's place. She would say things like that big house or all that space going to waste. Kendrick picked it up too, comments about how large the property was, how much yard I wasn't using, how the guest room sat empty most of the year. I let it slide. I thought it was just talking. Then, in January of last year, they sat me down after Sunday dinner and told me Brianna's parents were in a difficult situation. Her father, Dennis, had been laid off from a manufacturing job 6 months prior. Her mother, Carol, had some health expenses that had eaten through their savings. They were behind on rent. They needed somewhere to stay. Temporarily, they said. 3 months, maybe 4. Just until Dennis found work. I listened to everything. Then I said I was sorry to hear it, but my house wasn't available for that. Kendrick looked at me like I had said something in a foreign language. He said, "Dad, they have nowhere to go." I said, "Kendrick, that's a hard situation, but it's not my situation to solve by handing over rooms in my house." He said, "It's not like you're using them." That sentence landed differently than he probably meant it to. I felt something go cold in my chest. I said, "I'm using my house just fine, thank you." Brianna was quiet during most of that first conversation. She left with Kendrick, and I thought, maybe that's the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next 6 weeks, every time I saw them, the subject came up. At first it was gentle, then it became pointed. Brianna started making comments about how lonely I must be rattling around in that big house by myself. She said it would probably do me good to have some company. She said her parents were good people who just needed a hand. One time she said, "I don't understand why family means so little to you," and I had to take a breath before I responded because I had just paid for her wedding 14 months earlier. I spoke to my lawyer, Douglas, in February. Not because anything had happened yet, because I know how to read a situation. And this one was starting to feel like it was going somewhere I needed to be prepared for. Douglas has been my attorney for 11 years. He handles my business contracts, helped me set up my LLC, did my estate planning after Marlene died. He knows my affairs better than anyone alive. I told him what was happening. He listened carefully and said, "Alton, you're right to think ahead. Let's make sure everything is where you want it to be." We spent about 90 minutes that afternoon going over documents I hadn't reviewed in a while. By the time I left his office, I felt better. Not happy, but prepared. I want to tell you about the Thursday night in March, because that's where the pivot happened. Kendrick called me on a Thursday evening and asked if they could come over. He said they wanted to talk. I said, "Sure, come for dinner. I'll make something." I cooked chicken and roasted potatoes. I set the table properly the way Marlene always liked. When they arrived, Brianna brought her parents with her. I had not been told that would happen. Dennis and Carol sat at my dining room table, in Marlene's chair and in the chair that had been my father's when I inherited the set, and they smiled at me and said what a beautiful home I had. Carol said she had always heard so much about it. Dennis said the yard looked like a lot of work for one person. I served dinner. I was pleasant. But I knew what this dinner was. After the plates were cleared, Kendrick laid it out again. His in-laws needed a place. The guest rooms were empty. It would only be temporary. They had already looked at the 2 rooms on the east wing and thought they would be perfect. Brianna had apparently been in my house, in rooms I had not shown her, planning a layout. I set my coffee cup down slowly. I said, "I appreciate everyone coming tonight, but my answer hasn't changed. This house is not available." Dennis started to speak, something about how he and Carol weren't looking for charity, just a helping hand. And I said, "Respectfully, Dennis, I'm not speaking to you right now. This is a conversation between me and my son." Kendrick's face went red. He said I was being unreasonable. He said his mother would have wanted this. That one hit somewhere deep, and I think he knew it because he said it the way people say something when they want it to land hard. I didn't raise my voice. I said, "Don't do that. Don't use your mother for this." Brianna stood up. She said, "You being selfish. You have all of this and you won't share any of it with people who need help. You never think about anyone but yourself." I said, "Brianna, I need you to lower your voice in my house." She said, "This house should be helping family right now, not just sitting here." I said, "I want everyone to have a good evening. I think dinner is over." That's when Dennis reached across the table and put his hand on my arm, not gently, more like he was trying to hold me in place, and said, "Now wait a minute, let's not end the night like this." I stood up. I said, "Please take your hand off me." Kendrick said something under his breath. Brianna grabbed her purse off the back of her chair and she swung it. I think she was going toward the door, and the corner of it caught the side of my coffee cup and sent it off the edge of the table. The cup hit the hardwood floor and shattered, and the remaining coffee splashed across my leg and the bottom of my shirt. She looked at me. She didn't apologize. She said, "You better think hard about what kind of father you want to be," and then she walked out. Kendrick followed without a word. Dennis and Carol excused themselves quietly and were gone in about 45 seconds. I stood in my kitchen for a moment. I looked at the broken cup. It was part of a set Marlene had picked out. I had 4 of them left. I got a paper towel and I cleaned up the coffee. I swept up the pieces of the cup and put them in the trash. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, picked up my phone, and I sent Douglas a text that said, "It happened. Move to the next step." He responded in under 3 minutes. "Understood. I'll have the paperwork ready by Monday." I had not been waiting for something terrible. I had been waiting for clarity, and now I had it. Let me tell you what Douglas and I had been building since February. My house was already an irrevocable trust in my name. I had done that after Marlene died as part of basic estate planning. What we updated in February was the successor trustee arrangement and a specific clause that made very clear the conditions under which any family member could or could not make claims on the property during my lifetime. We also reviewed the operating agreement for my business. Kendrick had been working for Price Plumbing Supply for 3 years. He was a manager. He was good at the job. But his role had never been formalized in a way that gave him any ownership stake, because I had always intended to cross that bridge when I felt he was ready. We also made sure that the business documents clearly reflected that. On Monday, I was at Douglas's office at 8 in the morning. I signed several documents. I had a long conversation that I won't detail entirely, but by the time I left, everything was arranged in a way that reflected what I actually wanted, not what people were assuming I would eventually give them. On Tuesday, I called Kendrick and asked him to meet me for lunch. He came. He was guarded. I told him that I loved him and that nothing about that had changed, and that I needed him to understand something clearly. I would not be pressured into decisions about my home or my assets by anyone, including him. I told him that if he wanted to have a real conversation, without Brianna's parents present, without ultimatums, I was always willing to do that. He was quiet for most of lunch. He said he needed to think. He went home and told Brianna about the lunch. I know this because what happened next was not subtle. Brianna called me that afternoon. She said that if I didn't reconsider, they were going to have a conversation with my brother about what was really going on with my finances, implying, I think, some suggestion that I was not mentally capable of managing my own affairs. My brother Chester lives in Phoenix. He and I talk a few times a year. He has nothing to do with my finances. I said, Brianna, I'm going to stop you right there. I have a lawyer, an accountant, and a doctor who can all speak to my capabilities. Whatever conversation you're planning, go ahead and have it. Then I hung up. The next morning, I called Chester myself and told him exactly what had been happening and what Brianna had implied she intended to do. Chester was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Alton, what do you need from me? I said, nothing right now. I just wanted you to hear it from me first. He said, I've got your back. And that was enough. The following 2 weeks were tense. Kendrick stopped coming to Sunday dinners. He was still showing up to work, which I noticed and appreciated, but he wasn't speaking to me beyond what the job required. I didn't push it. I have never believed in chasing someone who is choosing distance. You leave the door open, and you wait. It was a Friday afternoon about 3 weeks after the dinner, when things broke open completely. I was in my office at the warehouse when my HR manager came in and told me that Brianna had called the main business line asking to speak to the company's accountant about payroll. She wasn't an employee. She had no standing to make that call. When our office manager told her she couldn't be connected, Brianna apparently said some things that made our office manager, who has worked for me for 8 years and is not easily rattled, close her office door and sit down for a minute. I called Douglas immediately. He said, Alton, this is actually useful. Document everything. Get me the details from your office manager in writing. I did exactly that. What Brianna didn't know, what I think neither she nor Kendrick had ever stopped to think carefully about, was that my business had a small business legal protection policy that included a clause about harassment and interference from non-employees. Douglas had flagged this policy to me back in February when we first started reviewing documents. He said at the time, let's just make sure this is current. I had renewed it in March. Douglas sent a formal letter to Brianna the following Monday. It was not aggressive in tone, it was simply precise. It outlined what had occurred, cited the relevant policy, and made clear that any further contact with Price Plumbing Supply by non-employees for non-business purposes would be treated as actionable interference. It also included, as a kind of postscript, a brief and very polite note about the incident with the coffee cup, and the suggestion that such conduct, if repeated, would be documented accordingly. I am told she read it 3 times before she put it down. Kendrick came to see me 2 days later. He came alone. He sat across from me in my office, the same office where I'd taught him how to read a ledger when he was 14, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, Dad, I don't know how we got here. I said, I think you do. He looked at the floor. He said Brianna's parents had found a solution. A family friend who had a rental property at below market rate. Dennis had gotten a job offer in Indiana. They were going to move in 2 weeks. I nodded. I didn't say anything about the letter. He either already knew about it or would find out eventually. He said, I said some things I shouldn't have said. I said, yes, you did. He said, especially about Mom. I said, especially about Mom. I said, especially about Mom. There was another long silence. He said, are we okay? I said, we're working on it. I want to be honest with you about that answer, because I know some of you would expect me to say yes, of course. "Come here, son. All is forgiven." And the love is there. The love has always been there. I never stopped loving my son for a single minute of any of this, but I also know that what happened in that kitchen, and what came after with the business, was not an accident. It was a pattern of behavior that revealed something I needed to understand about how my son was choosing to operate in the world, and about who he was listening to, and about whether he was capable of being the man I raised him to be when it actually mattered. Trust is not a switch you flip back on. So the answer is, we're working on it. And that's an honest answer. Here's what I need you to hear. If you're listening to this and you recognize any part of it, if you are a parent who has built something and felt the slow pressure of people treating your life's work like a resource they're entitled to manage, I need you to hear this clearly. Being calm is not the same as being passive. I never raised my voice. I never made threats. I never did a single thing I'm not comfortable telling you about right now. But I also never backed down. I made decisions ahead of time. I talked to the right people. I kept records. I stayed clear about what was mine and what I had chosen to give freely and what I had not. My home is still mine. My business is still mine. My business is still mine. My name is still intact. The tomatoes in the backyard came up again this spring. I planted them in April, same as every year. This time, the first Sunday in May, Kendra came over and we pulled weeds along the back fence together for about an hour without talking much. Then I made sandwiches and we ate on the back porch. It's not all the way back, but it's something, and I will tell you this, and I want you to really think about it. The moment everything shifted was not the broken cup. It was not the phone call from Brianna about my finances. It was not even the letter Douglas sent. It was the morning in February when I picked up the phone and called my lawyer before anything had happened yet. That was the moment. That's when I stopped reacting and started deciding. That's when I went from being someone things were happening to, into someone who was handling his own life. If you take nothing else from this story, take that. Get your documents in order before you need them. Know what's yours. Know who you're talking to. And when someone shows you who they are, especially if it's someone you love, believe them the first time. I believed them the first time. I believed them. I was ready, and that made all the difference. I've thought a lot about what actually caused all of this. Not who caused it, I mean what. Because when you strip away the dinner table and the broken cup and the letter from Douglas and the whole uncomfortable chain of events, what you're really looking at is a much simpler thing. People who had never been told no started believing that no wasn't an option. That's not Brianna's fault entirely. And it's not entirely Kendrick's either, if I'm being honest with myself. I gave him a lot. I gave him things before he asked for them. The car payment. The rent. The ring. The wedding. I did all of it because I wanted to, because Marlene and I always said, that's what you do when you're able. But somewhere in that generosity, and I sat with this long enough to say it plainly, I may have taught him that the door was always open, that asking was always going to lead somewhere, that my no was just a starting position in a negotiation. When Brianna said I was being selfish, she wasn't reading a character flaw. She was reading a pattern. She was wrong about what it meant, but she wasn't wrong that the pattern existed. What I did in February, calling Douglas before anything had happened, that was the first time in a long time that I acted from clarity instead of from love. And I want to be careful about how I say that, because I don't mean love and clarity are opposites. I mean that for years I had been letting love make all the decisions, and love without judgment isn't wisdom. It's just feeling. Feeling is not a plan. The intelligence part, the part that mattered, was understanding that I had to think 3 moves ahead, not because I wanted to fight, but because I could see one coming and I'd rather be standing on solid ground when it arrived. Douglas didn't create my protection. He helped me formalize what I had already built. The business. The trust. The years of documentation and structure. Intelligence isn't just what you know, it's what you do with what you know before you need it. The resilience part was quieter than people might expect. It wasn't dramatic. It was the Sunday mornings when I kept planting tomatoes even though Marlene was gone. It was showing up to work every day during those 2 weeks, when Kendrick wasn't speaking to me beyond what the job required. It was cleaning up the broken cup, washing my hands, and sitting down at the table to send a text instead of raising my voice. Resilience doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like just continuing. Just staying in your own life calmly, while the noise tries to rearrange you. And the moral part, the ethics, is the one I think about the most. I never did anything I'd be ashamed to say out loud. Everything I did, anything I'd be ashamed to say out loud. Everything I did was legal, documented, and fair. I didn't cut Kendrick out of my life. I didn't punish him vindictively. I drew a line and I held it. That's not cruelty, that's integrity. And I think if more people understood the difference between those two things, there would be a lot fewer broken cups and a lot fewer letters from lawyers. Kendrick and I are still working on it, slowly. I think he's starting to understand. I think someday we'll be able to sit on that back porch and talk about all of it plainly. I'm not in a hurry. I'm just going to keep planting tomatoes.